So good to see everybody here today. Started off, it looked like we were going to be a little short on the folks today. Now we're only a little short. Certainly glad to see everybody here today. I'm going to do something that I don't normally do today in my preaching. By and large, I tend to not focus on what the world is doing around us. By and large, my job, as I see it as a minister of the church, is to minister to the church. There are plenty of times when I will preach lessons to evangelize, to try to help those who may be outside of the church know about the love and the sacrifice of Christ and to come to the church. There may be some times where there are social issues that are affecting the church and how the church responds, how the church handles those social issues, and I will address those and have pretty extensively in some cases in the past. And then there are times where we have times that we need to learn new things, where we need to be exposed to new things, to new ideas. Sometimes I learn something new and I want to share it, and I've got a platform to do that. I try to focus on the church and the direct mission and the direct effect of Christians in the church. But today I want to address something that happened in pop culture last week. Now, many of you are probably aware of what happened. You might not know the details. You might not have watched it. I don't know how many people amongst the members of the church watched the Grammy Awards last Sunday night. I see a lot of people shaking their head no. I didn't watch it either, but I've heard about this and got caught up on what happened and saw what happened and thought, as Ravonda and I were talking about it, thought for a few minutes, and I said, you know what, I need to talk about this. And the reason why I need to talk about this is not because of what happened necessarily, but because of what was expected to happen because of it. So there's a lot going on here and a lot of moving parts when we talk about this. And we're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 28 here in just a little bit. So if you want to start turning to 1 Samuel 28, we're going to get there. And we're going to look at that passage because I think there is a direct correlation with what happened Sunday night with the Grammy Award and what happened with Saul here in 1 Samuel 28. Now, this passage is one of my favorites. I know I have a lot of favorite passages. This is definitely my favorite out of 1 Samuel, so that's for sure. And the surprise as to the effect of what Saul decided he wanted to do, and so there's some correlations here. We're going to make some references to New Testament passages and principles today, but we're going to stick here for our scripture today. So we want to kind of start outlining what the incident was all about. Now, on last Sunday night, celebrities, performers, and their followers basically tried to provoke Christians. Now, I say this because that's exactly what happened. There may be some people who say that the song and the performance that was performed at the Grammys last Sunday night was an artistic expression. I'm saying that's garbage. That's a garbage excuse for what happened. The entirety of what happened was to provoke Christians. Now, if you're not up on what happened, I'll give you a very quick little rundown. There was a celebrity who's been around for a very long time by the name of Madonna, who gleefully introduced two singers who do not think they are the gender that they really are, who decided to sing a song and put on a performance, and the song is titled Unholy, deliberately titled Unholy. Now, this song has been around for months. It's been around for months, and the song has gained 0% traction. Okay? So, what has happened is the main singer of the song, who says that he is neither male nor female, and the other singer in this performance, who says that he is not a he anymore, but instead a she, decided that they were going to dress up in bright red outfits with horns and tails and pitchforks and emulate priests of Satan stomping around and chanting and singing about how great it was to be anti-God, how great it was to be unholy, and how amazing it was for people to just kind of do whatever they wanted to do and to just kind of flaunt it in front of those people who would think in a more moral fashion, is basically what the song was, and basically what the performance was. And as that performance was going on, the crowd that was at the Grammys was clapping like a bunch of sea lions, thinking that it was great that somebody was sticking it to the Christians. Oh. That's what's going on. That was the incident. So the celebrities, the performers, who are all grasping to try to maintain popularity, to try to maintain significance, and to try to maintain commercial success, figured that the best way to get them some attention and to get some controversy and to allow their performance and their song to gain some traction so they could make some more money, thought the easiest and most expedient route to do that was to try to provoke Christians. Well, they kind of did. Now, what else is going on here? Well, first of all, they were playing dress up like they were worshiping Satan. Now, I've got to, and some people are going to disagree with me on this, and that's fine if you do. I'm not making this a matter of even debate here. Some people will say that that performance was Satan worship, that they were deliberately going out there and deliberately trying to worship Satan, the way they dressed, the way they danced, the way they chanted, the lyrics of the song, so on and so forth. I don't think they were. I don't think they were trying to deliberately go out and worship Satan, because I have actually in my lifetime met a couple of Satanists, like legit people that worship Satan, and they don't do stuff like this. They never have, and they probably never will. They try to provoke in other ways. And a really ham-fisted, out-of-tune, terribly timed, terribly sung Grammy performance is not the way they do it. Okay? So these people were playing dress up, like they were going to go out and worship Satan, in order to provoke a response, in order to provoke people to give them some attention by creating this controversy. And so we see what happened. And there are some people, again, who've already disagreed, who I've talked to who disagree with me. And they say, well, look, Brian, they're already showing that they belong to Satan, that they are already evil, and so on and so forth. And I will agree with that, but I will say that they are not trying to worship Satan. They are trying to worship themselves and to try to create that controversy in order to gain more internet clout, if you will. Now, here's the problem. Here's the problem and how this affects us, how this affects the church, and how this affects the world at large, and how it affects our efforts to try to go into the world and to save the world from sins. First of all, Christians object and fall into the trap where they, the performers and the celebrities and their adherents, point and laugh. And I looked at this because I'm involved in technology. I'm on the internet way more than I really want to be. And it doesn't take long of a Google search about the performance to see the reactions that people have to the reactions to the performance. And so there was one group who's actually fairly prominent, and the title of their response to this, and they have somewhat of a following in a newscast, and it says, "Christians freak out at Grammy performance." And so now, because people objected to this performance, the internet bobbleheads can point and laugh. And the people who want to be involved in this can point and laugh, and they can say, "Oh, look at those backward Christians. Look at those people in the South. They don't know. They don't understand. They're too dumb. Ha ha ha. And they're following their 2,000-year-old doctrines and stuff like that. Ha ha ha." And so people overreact. I say overreact, not necessarily, but they react in a way that doesn't show that they have a good understanding of what's happening there. And they start beating the drums, and they start yelling and screaming about Satanism and all these things. And maybe they're right about the Satan part, but the purpose of this entire thing was for people to overreact so that they could gain some attention. And so we fall into the trap of where we react, and then they point and laugh. Or the second part of the trap is Christians say nothing, and we fall into a different trap. We fall into the trap of letting this go. We fall into the trap of not addressing it. We fall into the trap of staying silent and going, well, you know what, they're just doing their own thing and they're going to do their own thing. But you see here, if we fall into the trap of silent acceptance and we fall into the trap of not addressing these kinds of problems, the world is going to continue to fill the moral vacuum that we leave when we don't address these things. And so we've got a lot of impressionable people in the world around us, including members of our own family, members of our own congregation, that may look at these things and interpret our silence as acceptance, that this is an okay way to perform, that this is an okay way to address the world, that this is an okay way to elevate evil behavior, selfish behavior, sinful behavior, and to downgrade and to denigrate Christian behavior. And so if we respond in one way, the world around us, society around us, is going to point and laugh at how ridiculous we are for objecting, for noticing their sinful behavior and objecting to their sinful behavior. But on the other hand, if we don't address it at all, we end up allowing sin and allowing evil to influence us. So what do we do? What do we do? How do we address this? Well, this is very, very important for us to understand. It's important for us to understand the trap that has been set for us when things like this come about. And it's kind of like what Jesus would do. When Jesus would go into the place and the Pharisees and the Sadducees would come up to him and they would go, okay, there was this woman that she was married to one brother and then he died and all the other brothers she ended up married to and they died. Now, who does she belong to in the resurrection? Jesus didn't fall into the trap, did he? He didn't say, well, there is no resurrection, so your question is pointless. Or he didn't say, well, she would belong to the first one. She said, you err not knowing the Scriptures or the power of God. We need to be in position where we understand the Scriptures and we understand the power of God and we understand these traps that are being laid for us left and right in this world. And so what do? Well, we understand what's really happening. First of all, they are playing worship Satan. By playing worship Satan, they are serving Satan, sin, and self. Now, if you go to books like the book of Romans and you look in chapter 5, you will see that Paul there tells the church at Rome, and by extension tells us today, that to whomever we submit ourselves, we become slaves. We become that bondservant to that sin. We become a bondservant to ourselves. We become a bondservant to those things that pull us further away from God. And when we talk about being a slave or we talk about being a bondservant, we have to know, we have to understand that that thing has become our master. And the master tells the slave what to do. The slave has no free will of their own. They cannot operate under their own power anymore. And so these people have been overcome by sin. And they are doing everything they can to spread that sin because they have no control over themselves anymore. Just like Paul tells us, God will give some over to their reprobate mind for their own destruction. And this is what's happening here. They don't know what else to do than to mock Christianity. They don't know what else to do than to serve themselves. They don't know what else to do than to serve sin. And I don't think that they were really trying to worship the devil, but they ended up doing it anyway. And so we see what's really happening here. And they're not playing a new game. This is nothing new. Just like Solomon said, there's nothing new under the sun. People have tried to skate around serving God. People have tried to skate around following the Lord and being free from sin since the Garden of Eden. And so even when Adam and Eve were there in the garden and they saw that fruit of the tree and they were told by the serpent that fruit is going to make you wise like God. And they said, well, I know God told us not to do this, but we can do this and be like Him. They didn't know what they were doing. To a degree. And so we see this is not a new game. They don't know why they're doing these things. They don't know what's behind it all. Because they think, oh, we're going to make fun of the Christians because, quite frankly, Christians are easy targets in modern society. We don't fight back. We don't fight back anywhere near enough. And we don't respond like some other religious groups or some other ideological groups do by shooting people and blowing things up. And we should never do that. We should never resort to violence. But we do need to respond. But we need to respond in the right way. But these people, by putting on this play, by putting on this show, really showed that they are enslaved to sin. And again, there is nothing new here, and that leads us to our passage today. So if you go to 1 Samuel chapter 28 and the story of the story of Saul going to this woman who's called the Witch of Endor, you're going to see some very interesting similarities here. And we'll point them out as we go. So when we start off reading verses 28 through, chapter 28, verses 5 through 7, we need some background here. First of all, Saul was leading the army against the attack of the Philistines. And the Philistines were winning. And Samuel, the prophet, had already died, and Saul wasn't getting any response back from the Lord. He would go and he would consult with the priests, and he would consult with people who were supposed to be prophets. And the Lord was silent. The Lord wasn't telling Saul anything. And so Saul was beginning to panic. He wasn't getting the response he wanted. He wasn't getting what he thought he needed. He wanted to preserve himself. He wanted to preserve his reign. He wanted to preserve his popularity. And he wasn't getting the response that he wanted to get. And so he decides to take on something that was beyond his capacity to understand. So in verse 5 we read, when Saul saw the army of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. And when Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, either by dreams or by Urim or by prophets. Then Saul said to his servants, seek out for me a woman who is a medium, that I may go to her and inquire of her. And his servants said to him, behold, there is a medium at Endor. So Old King James calls her a witch. Medium, some translations call her a necromancer. Either way, this was a job title, a position and occupation that was strictly prohibited by the Old Testament. And so those who were found amongst the people of Israel who were involved in these things were to be put to death. And so that was something that was very, very well known amongst the population here. And those who went to seek that out, seek any type of divination, were also to be put to death. But Saul was so desperate that he went to do something that he knew he should not be doing. We see some parallels already here, don't we? We see a lot of parallels here already, but the story continues. In verses 8 through 12 we read, so Saul disguised himself. Now, I want to pause right here for just a second. Saul played dress-up. So this singer who was singing this song, and terribly singing this song, by the way, because it was an awful song. Lyrics aside, it was just terrible. But he was playing dress-up. He was putting on bright red leotards and a bright red overcoat and a bright red top hat with horns on it. And he was dancing around like he was some type of priest going in front of a temple. And so we see here this idea of playing dress-up, this idea of disguising oneself. So Saul disguised himself and put on other garments and went, he and two men with him. And they came to the woman by night, and he said, divine for me a spirit, and bring up for me whomever I shall name to you. And the woman said, surely you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off the mediums and the necromancers from the land. Why then are you laying a trap for my life to bring about my death? But Saul swore to her by the Lord, as the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing. Now, I do want to stop here for just 1 second and mention this. It was not Saul's authority to punish or not to punish. There is no way Saul has any control over who God chooses to punish or not punish. But because Saul wanted a thing done, because Saul wanted his own personal needs met, he was willing to lay aside the laws of the Lord to make that happen. And we see people doing that all the time, taking what they know should be called immoral and saying it's perfectly fine as long as I am getting what I want out of this. Selfishness is that great divider between man and God, if there ever was one. But she knew the law, and she was in fear of the law. But Saul, the king of Israel, was not in fear of the law of God at this point in time. Verse 11 and 12. Then the woman said, "Whom shall I bring up for you?" And he said, "Bring up Samuel for me." Now this is where the story gets really, really interesting. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice. And the woman said to Saul, "Why have you deceived me? You are Saul." Verse 12 always puzzles me because there are two ways that you can think about it. One, I always wonder if the witch, the medium at Endor, could actually do this thing. And two, I wonder if she was kind of a scam artist. Imagine if she were able to do this thing and had done it before. And she was terrified at who she brought up. That it was Samuel the prophet, the man of God, the spokesman for the Lord Almighty. Or if, two, she was a scam artist and had never actually done that before. And it worked this time. For whatever reason, however this shook out, God allowed it to happen this time. And God allowed one to come back from the dead in order to speak the words of God. Remember the story of the rich man and Lazarus? Kind of opposite of what happens here. And this woman, this witch, this medium, this necromancer is terrified. As well she should be. Because she did not know what she was doing. She did not know what she was getting into. She did not know the nature or the consequences of what she was about to do. And she cries out to Saul, "Why have you deceived me? You are Saul." Then the king said to her, "Do not be afraid." She is terrified, and I don't blame her. She needs to be. "What do you see?" And the woman said to Saul, "I see a god coming up out of the earth," probably a spirit type thing, maybe what we would call a ghost. Again, God allowed it to happen this time. He said to her, "What is his appearance?" And she said, "An old man is coming up, and he is wrapped in a robe." And Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed with his face to the ground and paid homage. I don't know who Saul is bowing down to worship here, but he has got this all wrong. He is not worshiping who he needs to worship. He is not penitent like he needs to be penitent. He is not contrite and brokenhearted like he needs to be. He is not seeking the face of God. He is seeking something that God has strictly prohibited in order to serve himself. And yet here he is, bowing down. But Samuel doesn't leave that alone. Then Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" And Saul answered, "I am in great distress, for the Philistines are warring against me, and God has turned away from me, and answers me no more, neither by prophets or by dreams. Therefore I have summoned you to tell me what I shall do." Now Saul has one thing very much right here. God has turned away from him. And doing this isn't going to help him a bit. 16 and 17, and Samuel said, "Why then do you ask me, since the Lord has turned from you and become your enemy?" Remember what Jesus said. Friendship with the world is enmity toward God, and this is what enmity toward God looks like. "The Lord has done to you as he spoke by me, for the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David. Because you did not obey the voice of the Lord and did not carry out his fierce wrath against Amalek, therefore the Lord has done this thing to you this day." Verse 19. Again, one of those terrifying passages of the Scriptures. "Moreover, the Lord will give Israel also with you into the hand of the Philistines. And tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The Lord will give the army of Israel also into the hands of the Philistines." Saul did not know what he was doing. And not only did he pay the price, his sons paid the price. Jonathan, David's best friend, his close ally, died because of the sins of his father. The army of Israel was routed and destroyed because of the sins of Saul the king. We see all of this happen because Saul did something and he did not understand what was going on. He did not know what he was doing. And because he was playing around with these things, with things he did not understand, with things that God had warned him to stay away from, he paid dearly with the consequences. Do we see those parallels continuing? I do. Very clearly, I can see what happens when people play around with things that they don't understand. And they decide that they're going to amuse themselves by dressing up as the devil and bouncing around on stage, singing and chanting and talking about how great it is to be unholy and how great it is to be against God. They don't understand the wrath that they're heaping up upon themselves. So what do? What do? How do we respond to these kinds of things? Because sometimes we want to scream and shout and go, what in the world are you doing? Do you not know how bad it is to be engaged in this? And other times we're thinking, well, you know what? They're digging their own grave. They're making their own bed. I think we have to have this biblical response here. First of all, we need to identify the real problem. I don't think they were worshiping the devil directly. I don't think they were trying to. I think they were trying to make fun of and provoke Christians. They didn't hurt my feelings. I'm not mad at them. I'm not upset. It's a sad, pitiful, low-rent attempt to try to gain traction based on my outrage. And quite frankly, I'm not so outraged about it. Because people of the world are going to do things that people of the world are going to do, and they're flailing against God. God said that they're going to hate me because they first hated him, and I'm not surprised. That doesn't mean I'm not going to do anything. But I'm going to identify the real problem. And I'm going to respond correctly. I'm going to respond appropriately. And I'm going to tell them in one way or another, I'm going to say, you know what? What you've done is ignorant. What you've done is foolish. You haven't harmed me. You haven't hurt my feelings. You haven't upset me. But because I am a child of God, and because I know that God loves you as much as he loves me, I'm going to let you know that you're playing with things that you don't understand. And making fun of me is not going to help you in the long run. So let's address the real problem. But we do need to stand in the gap against this kind of evil. We do need to speak up against it. We do need to speak up against it in the right way, in the effective way. And letting people know that that type of silliness, that type of ignorance is only going to lead them to further separation from God. And it's going to continue to work on searing their conscience where the Word of God will not penetrate because they won't let it in. And so we need to let people know that the things that they are doing in ignorance are going to lead them further and further away from God. And we need to understand why, when Jesus was being nailed to the cross, he said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. These people don't know what they're doing. They've got their own selfish motivation. They think they know why, but they really don't. And we need to warn people not to fall into the traps that have been set for them. For us, as the children of God, we need to not fall into the trap of committing our own sin while trying to address this sin. We need to make sure that we don't fall into the trap of complacency so we allow this type of sin to grow unchallenged and unchecked. But we need to respond to the right problem in the right manner. But we also need to warn the people of the world that the trap that's been set for them is to think that they can ridicule and mock God, and that there are no consequences for that. And it's not that just ridiculing and mocking God leads to a special set of consequences. In fact, all sin leads to the same consequence. And in fact, that sin is common to man, for there are none righteous, no, not one. We have all sinned and fall short of the glory of God. But turning your back on God, mocking Christ, mocking the crucifixion, mocking the death, burial, and resurrection, mocking the church, that prevents you from accessing the only solution there is to the sin that separates you from God. God didn't put you there. You put you there. God didn't put me there. I put me there. I don't need the devil to help me do bad things. I can do all those bad things all by myself. But I do need Christ to save me from my sin. I hope this has helped us gain a perspective. Not just on this incident, but on the things of the world and how we as Christians need to navigate the world. How we need to align ourselves and how we need to address the real problem. There are other things that we need to do in this arena, in the arena of apologetics, in the arena of evangelism. And as we go through our series this year on being the church, we're going to talk about several of those things. But for today, right now, the gospel call goes out to each one of us. So if you're here and you are not yet a child of God and you need to be baptized to have your sins washed away, know that you can do that today based on your hearing of the Word, your belief in Christ Jesus, your repentance of sin, and your confession of Christ's name before men. Then your feet can be set on that straight and narrow path, guided by your faith and by God's grace and His mercy. You can have that home in heaven secured for all eternity. If you're here, you are a child of God, but you find that sin has entered back into your life. And maybe it's because you don't know what you're doing. Maybe it's because you're just flailing around trying to be a friend of the world and creating enmity with God, and you need to repent of that sin. Or if there's a specific sin you know that you're involved in, you need to ask for forgiveness of that as well. You can do so today. So if you're here and you have any spiritual need, why don't you come, meet me up front and let that need be made known as we stand and sing our invitation song.